Speaking about foreign DNA, John Ramsey made a strange remark at CrimeCon 2 years ago. Listen to what he says, and I'll put a link to the clip in the description.
They tried very hard to explain away why there was foreign male DNA in a number of JonBenet's clothing items. It would be in their best interest to test it, find out that it belonged to one of Burke's little friends that happened to be there.
Hey, hold on 1 second.
I thought we were looking for foreign male DNA. This is something else altogether. This is a familiar male's DNA. Isn't that what John seems to be talking about here? But
that's impossible.
Because this is something, and we probably need a loud banging sound here. This is something we haven't spoken about at all until now.
That's impossible.
Are we, and is John, really talking not about a strange intruder and not a Ramsey family member, but something, or rather someone in between? Okay, but who?
Who are you?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, what we want to try to do in this analysis, in this episode, is try to find that fourth card. And it's definitely not an easy one. And I know what you're thinking, and you're right. Now, regarding this idea of two perpetrators and someone who's not entirely a stranger.
Well, that's a very entertaining story, but unfortunately real detectives have to worry about that little thing called evidence.
Indeed. And is there any? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Incidentally, in the previous episode about the media narrative, I made an error. I referred to the article from the Washington Post when it should be the Washington Times. If you haven't read that article, I do recommend you read it. I'll put a link to that in the description. Also, look out for an analysis I've been really wanting to share with you guys for a long time, and that is to do with the photographic narrative surrounding this case. That should be quite interesting. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So it's one thing to suggest a particular scenario. It's another to say, well, is there any evidence that supports it? And so taking our cue from what John said at the beginning, what does Lawrence Schiller say about this kind of subject matter? Well, he touches on this obliquely on this topic in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. It is this reference. And he makes it just after referring to the broken paintbrush and the knot on the ligature, kind of describing the knot. And it's immediately after that he writes, Burke's friends and their parents had yet to be interviewed. More DNA testing had to be done in the hope of finding a match for the foreign DNA. Now, you may remember in June 1998, following Boulder PD's huge 2-day presentation, and this is covered in the Netflix series. And remember, this presentation was an effort to convince District Attorney Alex Hunter that a grand jury trial was necessary, that they had enough evidence for that. And remember, it didn't convince him. And so the takeout from the big kahuna prosecutors was this, also from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Bob Miller developed a long to-do list, people to re-interview and loose ends to be tied up. Among those to be questioned were friends of the Ramseys, and get this, and this needs to be circled, children who had played with JonBenet, and then a long list of peripheral people who had yet to be excluded as suspects. Now, top of the to-do list was questioning and investigating not just Burke's friends, but JonBenet's friends, basically a pool of peripheral people who were friends of the Ramseys. And so which people come to mind when we think of that? Who were the peripheral people in the neighborhood? Who were people that were coming into the Ramseys' orbit relatively often? And then I guess another question is, were DNA tests done on these peripheral people? also, were these friends questioned? And if you read between the lines, just prior to the green lighting of the grand jury investigation, the cops wanted effectively to talk to children. Am I wrong about that? If you go back through what I've just said to you, am I wrong about that assessment? Part and parcel of the fabric of the Ramsey case is that the Ramsey kids interacted with a bunch of neighborhood kids on Christmas Day, as well as on Christmas night, at the dinner party with the Whites, and then even after that. What did these kids see and know that we don't know about? And this seems to be a major part of the puzzle that is missing from almost all of the investigators, all of the detectives, all of the police work. And I think the heart on JonBenet's palm, our ace of hearts, suggests this is where some piece of the puzzle is missing. The investigators seem to think so too, certainly at this point, after 18 months of investigating, after reviewing 18 months of work, and they thought that they were at the same place. And so one of the first things they did after their 18-month review presentation, and this is even before they questioned the Ramseys in their second police interview. Well, what was their priority? It was to talk to the little girl's brother. And they did that on June 10th, June 11th, and June 12th for 2 hours a day for 3 days. That's a total of 6 hours of interrogation. Only little snippets of that interview have ever been made public. And if you want me to go into that interview in a lot more detail, let me know in the comments. But the fact is, after this review presentation, they wanted to talk to Burke. And it was only 2 weeks after that JonBenet's parents were interviewed, this time armed with Burke's version of events, to kind of cross-reference what the parents were saying in relation to that. And there were some important and incidental questions to ask, like, was Burke still awake? And remember what the outcome was of simple questions like that. For example, was Burke awake during the 911 call? Now, we definitely do need to deal with what we know from those interviews, because there are some questions and there are actually some problems. I'm talking about those interviews with Burke. And we will get to that. I think we do need to get to that. But first, I feel we need to join the dots and try to find our way via the established evidence, via the knowable fabric of this case, to a position where we can be holding all the aces. Or what do you think? Can we get ourselves to that position? One of the first aces I showed you, and this is simply based on a theory based on evidence, but a theory all the same, that was the Ace of Hearts. Do you remember what that represented? It was this idea that someone drew a heart on JonBenet's hand. I saw many people scoffing at this, many taking the position that, to me, it doesn't look like a heart. If that's the case, you really shouldn't listen to the rest of this video, because this hypothesis is essentially built on that one. So if you think it's not a heart drawn on JonBenet's hand, now would be a really good time to press stop and sort of just head somewhere else, because you really don't want to know the rest of this hypothesis if you don't accept that one. Is that clear? And if you're going to be scoffing at me saying, well, to me it doesn't look like a heart, I'm going to say, that's odd, because even John and Patsy, when questioned, accepted it was. Lou Smith accepted it was. All the detectives did. Kolar, Thomas, Linda Arndt, as far as I know. I mean, she was present at the autopsy. The media have accepted it. And what could be a better, more credible source than the coroner, whose job is to examine her body and photograph her body? And this is how you get to the point where you ruin the whole symphony. This is a point where I'm potentially ruining the whole symphony, but it's also possible that you are, if you're not accepting a particular position. So it's a very delicate point, because you look at a picture for 5 seconds with your already seriously limited attention span, and then you decide you know better. And maybe you do. But if there's no curiosity, there's no open-mindedness, instead there's this single-mindedness, this misinformed dumbness, this sort of soldier mindset, I'm not going to even consider this possibility, well, then you shouldn't. Then you should head somewhere else. But we've got to be careful not to be equally dumb, even if we have an Ace of Hearts, right? Even if that is true, can we really use it? So we don't want to be equally dumb as well and assume that it's definitely going to take us somewhere. We've got to test whether it's going to take us somewhere. And so we've got to ask the question honestly and try and get the answer in a genuine way to the question, can we really use the Ace of Hearts to find our way to the last remaining card, the Ace of Diamonds? And can I be honest with you? I'm not 100% sure we can. I think we might, but I'm not absolutely sure, which is to say, although I have a theory, I'm not sure I can prove it. And you might say, hey, this isn't a court of law, it's a court of public opinion, we're just sharing ideas here, and you don't need to prove it. Fair enough. But when making these sorts of arguments, I think we still need to aspire to fairly high standards. Maybe not that of a court of law, but certainly not no standards, right? Okay, so with that being said, what do we have? What do we have? Where can we take this? So let's start from the top. Let's start with what we know. We see John in 2022 at CrimeCon in front of an audience referring to testing the DNA of his son's playmates.
Is it really so hard to believe?
Because we've just gone through the archive and we see the police recommending essentially the same thing. The fact that this happens 18 months into the investigation also seems to be significant, doesn't it? And overall, can we say this seems to give broad reinforcement, if nothing else, to the idea not only of the Ace of Hearts, but the Ace of Clubs? This idea that in order for an almost simultaneous injury to occur using a softball bat, this ushers in the Ace of Spades as well. This inference from the autopsy that there might not be one, but a second person we may have missed who was right there during the execution of the crime. Okay, now that's 3 cards. What about the 4th?
Who are you?
I'm not going to lie, the next one is difficult and damn tricky too. We have to approach this one carefully with real caution. I think that one of the ways to approach the Ace of Diamonds is via the analogy of the high-tech boots. And I'm going to take you down that sort of, almost as a thought experiment, as an analogy for the way to approach this actual question. And here's what I mean. Did you know that one of the most important, the most critical areas of the Ramsey investigation ended up being the high-tech shoe print in the basement? I mean, it was right beside the child's body. Who did it belong to? And just have a look at these words from Steve Thomas. The high-tech boot print became one of the biggest questions of the investigation. And what was that question?
Who are you?
And to find out who this boot print belonged to, the cops went down a whole bunch of rabbit holes. They interviewed something like 400 people. Now imagine that, going to 400 people and asking them about their footwear. That would be something like going to 10 very large classrooms and asking everyone in there to talk about their shoes. Everyone in 10 full classrooms, at least, probably even more than that. But in this case, all adults. And they got absolutely nowhere because they were approaching the case, it seems, through their own projections. They were adults imposing adult psychology onto everything they were looking at. Lou Smith and Steve Thomas were particularly prone to this sort of psychological bias, in my opinion. But eventually a breakthrough came, and it was through talking to 2 little boys, as far as I know. And I'm not going to mention the name of the other one, but I believe it was determined through their testimony to the grand jury in the late 1990s that Burke did own high-tech boots, and it was likely his shoe print in the basement. And this made sense. He lived there, and it was his Christmas or birthday gifts that were still down in the wine cellar with a tear in it. Have a look. Look closer. Look at the bottom left corner, and then again in this image. Look at that fragment of FAO Schwartz wrapping paper lying right next to the blanket. And right next door was his train room, basically a room with his name on it, Burke's train room. So why not just say so? Why all the subterfuge? Now, I have to qualify this by noting that as recently as 2016, on Dr. Phil, the Ramsey lawyer at the time, Lynn Wood, I understood that he seemed to categorically state that Burke didn't own high-tech boots. And this is 17, 18 years after the grand jury trial. So maybe something new developed that I don't know about. But have a look at this headline from the Mirror. Burke Ramsey never owned a pair of high-tech boots. I mean, that seems fairly categorical. Or maybe not, because Burke himself said the following.
There was a footprint in the mold on the ground of the basement, and the investigators thought that it was from a hiking boot.
Yeah.
Did you own any hiking boots that you might have worn in the basement at some time?
Yeah, I did. I don't remember the brands, but I remember it had a little compass on the shoelace.
And the investigators point to that footprint as evidence against you.
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
It's my house. I went and played in the basement all the time with the train set. So if they determined that to be my footprint, that doesn't really prove anything.
Now, this is quite an extraordinary moment where Burke is confronted in an apologia setting where basically it's all about showing Burke in a good light and the Ramsey case in a positive light as well. And Burke basically says, in a way, why would it be a big deal if I was down there? Well, it is quite a big deal if you're standing in the wine cellar. I mean, aren't you locating yourself in terms of this crime scene? And I think the critical question here is, how long had that boot print been there? And how long was it likely to have been there? If you think about Patsy, because that's where they stored the Christmas decorations, how long would that boot print likely have survived there given all the traffic through there? Wasn't it left there after all of the traffic? Of course, there's a flip side to the story, as there is with all of these sort of conjectures in the Ramsey case, and that is Burke is saying here something without saying anything. He's saying high-tech shoes have got a compass logo, but he doesn't say he had high-tech shoes. But he said he had shoes with a compass logo. That's the Ramsey case for you. And if this isn't narrative staging, it's a kind of narrative hedging, isn't it? But isn't it interesting? It took something like 20 years to get this sort of answer from Burke in a kind of a public setting, which is a kind of a non-answer. And the high-tech saga is probably another one we need to dig into in a proper deep dive all of its own, because it provides yet another analogy to the shape-shifting, gaslighting, Bermuda Triangle weirdness that's all over this case. And you might say, haven't we just gone into it? No, we have barely even touched on it. And one of the weird things about this case is you can just never get your hands on any solid information. Everything is slippery, and everything, even when you think you have it, seems to slip through your fingers. If we pull out some of our cards now and we focus on trying to join the dots to make our way to the Ace of Diamonds, where do we start, given the analogy I've just shared with you? How do we start to address the most critical question of all? In the same way that we want to know who is the owner of the shoes that left this imprint in the mold. Also, what is the signature? Who is the person who constructed the knot? Also, who was wielding a particular kind of weapon, such as the softball bat? All of these are essentially different ways of asking the same question.
Who are you?
Who killed JonBenet Ramsey? I think if the heart on the hand is such a critical clue, we have to try to find the answer in the timeline. When was this heart drawn? And also, who drew it? We've spent so much time inside the Ramsey home looking at the note, looking in the various rooms, looking at the autopsy. What aren't we looking at? Well, what if we move back a little further out of the timeline? Not the part where the Ramseys go to the Whites and Burke gets electrocuted. Well, he gets kind of a mild shock, touching a deer fence. And not the part where John and Fleet are sitting on the floor with their daughters, helping them put pieces of jewelry together. We've dealt with that. What haven't we dealt with? Well, what about the bit between leaving the Whites and arriving home? We know they didn't go straight home, so where did they go? Could something have happened in this window? So let's look a little more closely at this aspect from the timeline. On Christmas Day, or more accurately, Christmas night, Now we are at 20 minutes. This is where you're really going to need to get those attention spans on track. Keep listening, keep focusing, keep concentrating. And to reiterate, if we say we know they didn't go straight home, and so where did they go? Remember where the police were after 18 months during that presentation, after that presentation. They were also, if you think about it, sort of at this point. I think we need to look at the people that were peripheral to the Ramseys. Well, when the Ramseys left the Whites, they were entering that periphery. They were encountering that periphery, weren't they? Top of the to-do list was questioning and investigating not just Burke's friends, but JonBenet's friends, basically a pool of peripheral people who were friends of the Ramseys. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. And I think this is the Whites' perspective of Christmas Day. The Whites were up early, opening presents with their kids and Priscilla's parents. That afternoon at about 4:30, the Ramseys with JonBenet and Burke arrived at the Whites' house. They would join the Whites, the Coxes, and Alison Shooney, Priscilla's sister, and her boyfriend Cliff Gaston for Christmas dinner. Afterwards, the adults, along with the kids, played on the floor. Then some neighbors came over for Christmas caroling. That's important. Who were they, and did their kids come over as well? Fleet White and the kids joined the group in singing. At around 9:30 p.m., White said the Ramseys left, saying that they were going to drop off gifts for other friends, the Steins and the Walkers. Well,
Not exactly.
more like the other way around. If we're going to do this, we've got to do this right. The Ramseys went to the Walkers first, and then the Steins, and then home, in that order. And I think it is important that we do be accurate about that order. Now let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. When the Ramseys left the White's house, they stopped off at their friends, the Walkers, to drop off some presents. And as far as I know, it included a basket. And then they stopped briefly at the home of the Steins, who were also friends. Glenn Stein, 48, was Vice President for Budget and Finance at Colorado University. The Stein's son, Doug, was about Burke Ramsey's age. Patsy talked to Susan Stein for about 10 minutes. By that time, JonBenet was asleep in the backseat of the car. During a conversation between John Ramsey and Detective Arndt on the morning of December 26th, Ramsey said that the family arrived home at about 10 p.m. He pulled their Jeep Cherokee next to their Jaguar in the garage and then carried JonBenet upstairs to her room. That's that story. Now, we know very little about their visit to the Walkers, but we do know that Roxy was a friend of Patsy's and that the Walker and Stein kids went to the same school. I think it's High Peaks Elementary. And, as the Ramsey kids. We also know that Roxy and Patsy played in a women's softball team called Mom's Gone Bad. And this team was, I think, sponsored by Access Graphics / Lockheed Martin. We know this from an interview another Ramsey friend, Judith Phillips, the family photographer, gave CBS, which was later sued into silence. Have a look at this. In Boulder, we became even closer friends because we were on a softball team together, Mom's Gone Bad. Of all things, that's the name of our team. They had a lot of friends, lots and lots of friends from Boulder. They were both really good hosts. You always felt really welcomed when you walked through the door. I mean, Patsy was fun to be around. She was a showgirl. So her clothing, her home, she is a girl that never compromised. Then the photographer is asked, did your daughter play with JonBenet? She answers, even though my daughter was Burke's age, she ended up playing with JonBenet. So do you see, Judith's daughter is another little playmate, but what we want to do now is move from the Walkers to the Ramseys' last stop that night before going home, the Steins. Before we get to that, just one more thing. Do you notice that Judith refers to a softball team? And that is why we've got to be very careful when we look at the evidence in this case, not to gloss over whether something's a baseball bat or a softball bat. And there is a difference between the two.
They came to our house, and I talked to Patsy for a while, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And they all seemed perfectly normal, perfectly the same. They were all bubbly about Christmas and about where they were going. And my husband and I waved goodbye to them as they drove home, and that was the last time we saw them as an intact family.
Now, that is from a rare interview Susan Stein gave for JonBenet's America. And one's got to be very careful putting static over that interview. Otherwise, you might not be allowed or able to watch it. And that is a pro-Ramsey documentary chock full not only of apologia, but apologists. Even John Ramsey's first wife, Lucinda, even his kids, Melinda and John Andrew, vouch for the Ramseys in this film, and in particular areas. They go into particular areas defending the Ramseys. And the Ramseys, of course, appear in this documentary themselves at length. And yes, Susan Stein. Contextually, what else do we know about this documentary? Well, look at this article from the Boulder Daily Camera. Ramsey documentary presents intruder theory. The 50-minute documentary co-produced by University of Colorado journalism professor Michael Tracy. Haven't we just mentioned someone else that's somehow affiliated with the University of Colorado? This documentary came out at a critical time for the Ramseys, 1998, and it appeared designed to steer sentiment in support of the Ramseys right in the midst of the grand jury investigation. Now again, do you remember what Ann Bardach said? That the district attorney could leak things, the Ramseys could leak things, the Ramseys could participate in documentaries, meanwhile the police weren't really allowed to say anything. It's quite an interesting situation to be when you are facing kind of a long ongoing investigation and people aren't sure what to think. Well, isn't this going to shape the way the public thinks about things one way or another? Incidentally, the same Michael Tracy who produced this apologia appears in Joe Berlinger's Netflix apologia this year, 20 years later. I want to conclude by doing just a little statement analysis on Susan Stein. Do you mind if I do that? Susan only mentions Patsy here by name. What about JonBenet, and Burke? And we really want to put that writing on screen and look at it at length and carefully, right? She only mentions Patsy by name. And how can she say they all seem perfectly normal if she didn't see JonBenet? I mean, if JonBenet was inside the car sleeping, as the Ramseys claimed. So...
Ooh, yeah. I'm going to have to go ahead and sort of disagree with you there.
Disagree how? Well, I'm going to say I actually think JonBenet was awake. And I think she got out the car, and to take it further, I think when the Ramseys arrived home, she was still awake. And she was awake until after midnight, and she ate pineapple late that night as well. So I think it's possible JonBenet got that red heart drawn on her hand at the Steins. I'm just saying it's possible. It's one possibility. It's one possibility, admittedly, of several. It could also have been drawn later that night when some in the Ramsey home were asleep. It's also interesting how unsure John and Patsy are about Burke's movements when they arrived at the Steins. Haney, the Steins, Ramsey, the Steins. So it was either just myself or maybe Burke and myself. And what she's referring to there is who went into the home, the Steins' home, during this dropping off of gifts, right? Patsy's saying, I can't really remember. It was either me or me and Burke. And she's basically saying, I don't think John was with me and I don't think JonBenet was with me, right? So it's interesting because Patsy remembers giving a bottle of perfume to Roxy Walker. Now, think about that level of detail. I remember giving her a bottle of perfume. And it's on a night that you'd imagine the memories would be burned into her brain. You know, the very last moments she spent with JonBenet. And yet she's quite fuzzy about Burke in this particular instance. She goes on to say, best I remember, we went to the Walkers first and I took this bottle of perfume to Roxy. And then we went to the Steins and I had a basket of things to give to them. And I think I went by myself. Burke may have jumped out of the car because it's his friends. Meanwhile, John's memory seems to be even fuzzier. And this is how he describes it. Pulled up out the front of their house. Patsy certainly went in. I don't think I did. I don't remember if Burke did or not. I don't think JonBenet did, but I don't remember for sure. it wouldn't have been unusual for Burke to go in because that was his buddy Doug. And so this would be a question you might want to ask Burke Ramsey. Dr. Phil might have wanted to ask him, did you go into the house with Doug? And I know what you're thinking. You might say, so what? Why would you want to ask a silly question like that? Well, there's actually an important reason, and we'll get to that right now. Because Lou Smith says, did you have a gift for Doug? Great question. Another way of asking it is, did Burke have a gift for Doug? Did Burke have a gift for his friend on Christmas? John Ramsey answers, I don't know. He doesn't say no. He says, I don't know. I know Patsy probably, but I don't recall. So what does that actually mean to say, I know Patsy probably? What? So Patsy probably had a gift for Doug. So did Patsy give a gift for Doug or to Doug on the behalf of the entire family, or on Burke's behalf? Why wouldn't Burke give it to him directly? Why wouldn't Burke want to give it to him directly? And wouldn't you remember if you'd gotten Doug a gift? And here John makes an interesting admission that Burke and Doug were friends. And then Lou, bless him, asks this terrific question, did you have a gift for Doug? And you might say, why are you repeating yourself? We've already gone there. No, but we actually haven't. Because what are the implications of this whole thing? Remember, it's Christmas night, and they are heading to the Walkers and the Steins expressly to wish them a happy Christmas and to give them a gift. Is that all? Susan Stein, in her interview for JonBenet's America, doesn't go into any detail, which makes it easy to overlook yet another contextual aspect. The Ramseys aren't just dropping by to drop off a gift. They're there to say goodbye because they're also about to fly to Michigan the next morning, and then they're going to go on a cruise after that. So they aren't going to be seeing each other for a good long while. The other aspect that's easy to miss is whether the Steins got the well-to-do, big-shot Ramseys a gift of any kind. That's the flip side of it. Did the Steins get the Ramseys anything? Because that's not mentioned here. Why isn't it? And more pertinently, whether they got the Ramsey kids a gift, because isn't this friendship between the Ramseys and the Steins contingent essentially on the friendship between Burke and Doug? And do you really think if there was a Christmas part 2 on the cards here, that the kids would be sleeping in the car? Or for that matter, when they arrived home? They've just gotten another haul of gifts, possibly, potentially, likely at the Whites. I think there was the possibility that they might go to the Fernies and get something there as well, and although they changed their minds, and then the Steins. Now let's take this whole idea even further. The Steins are also in a way indebted to the Ramseys for their big Christmas bash, with Santa Claus present, games and activities for the kids. They pulled out all the stops for that. Meanwhile, the adults had their own drinks and entertainment. And it wasn't just a little gathering. Patsy Ramsey said that the Steins, Glenn and Susan Stein, and their son Doug, and Susan's mother was there, and Glenn's mother. So it was a big thing that the Ramseys put on for the entire Stein family, and then a lot of other people as well. You would imagine that the Steins would be quite grateful for that 2 days later and would want to show that, wouldn't they? Now, the problem with discussing this case at any other time of the year is it feels very hypothetical. And I think it feels totally different when you're talking about it with the memory of Christmas fresh in your mind. And so I don't know about you, but I also visited friends of mine, and some folks came to me to drop off gifts before they left on their trip ahead of Christmas. And so it's not just to say goodbye, it's not just the gesture of Merry Christmas, it's also a kind of farewell. And so was there an exchange of gifts ahead of Christmas or at a different time to Christmas based on this whole situation? And that's not all. Look at what Susan Stein also says in her statement. We, meaning my husband and I, she doesn't just say we waved goodbye to them. She is quite specific. We, my husband and I, waved goodbye to them. Aren't you forgetting someone? Isn't Susan Stein leaving someone out in this story? And so the next question that arises is, I guess, what sort of buddies were Burke and Doug? Where does Doug fit into the hierarchy of Burke's friends? The higher he is, the more likely it is that not only Burke would have received a gift. I mean, from Doug, but JonBenet too, even potentially. And also, the better friends they were, the more likely it is that the gift would be something quite special, perhaps even something quite expensive. And obviously, contingent to this question, the closer Burke was to any friend in particular, the more likely this friend would be a frequent visitor to the home, and also the more likely he'd be invited to sleepovers. Of course, the opposite holds as well. If Doug wasn't really a really good friend of Burke's, there probably wouldn't have been an exchange of gifts, and he probably wasn't someone who visited Burke very often. We just don't know the answer to that question. But what do we know? Well, let's go to the Ramsey housekeeper, Linda Wilcox, the predecessor to Linda Hoffman Pugh. And she says, the thing that struck me weird about the house, it seemed really odd to me that she seemed like the only person who had any kind of joy. That's a reference to JonBenet. You know, to smile or show any exuberance. Nidra didn't particularly like Boulder. She always talked about their house in Atlanta and what Patsy had done to it. And she talked about the South all the time and how Boulder was so backward. And Patsy was, okay with it, but things weren't exactly great. And she had the cancer and the adversity. She was consumed with the cancer thing after that. Everything revolved around it. Now think about how that must feel for the other people in that house, the kids. And then Burke, his friends were his world. He kind of lived in his own world. Basically, he had this whole group of friends and they had sleepovers. JonBenet never had sleepovers. She slept at her friends' houses occasionally, but it was never reciprocated. I thought that was kind of odd. What do you think? Is it odd? Maybe you could say JonBenet was too young to be having sleepovers. And so what we have is one of the housekeepers saying that Burke had sleepovers all the time. So who was sleeping over? And did he have a sleepover that night?
I don't know. Just don't know.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.